have you ever wondered why we tend to pair certain foods together? I'm talking about like cheese and wine, spaghetti and meatballs, even cookies and milk. And what makes these pairs a match made in heaven? Well, others really seem to clash. And I know you might be thinking, well, cooking, it's just an art. But no, there's a ton of science behind it. And there's even a whole research area looking into why we tend to pair these foods over and over again. So welcome to the world of food pairing and get ready to never quite see a meal the same again. We definitely have to start with the food pairing hypothesis because this is the most widely accepted theory looking at why do we match certain flavors over and over again, and it's thought to transcend things like individual preference or individual recipes. Now, this theory is the brainchild of a Michelin-starred chef, Heston Blumenthal. And luckily, this theory is very straightforward, which I love. I never take that for granted in science. I love a straightforward hypothesis. This theory just says that the more aromatic compounds two ingredients or two foods share, the better match they will be. So a good match has a lot of flavor overlap, while a bad match has very little to no flavor overlap. Before we move on, just a quick note on flavor, because I've noticed that people tend to think flavor and taste is the same thing, but they're not synonyms. Taste is just one component of flavor, because flavor actually means not only the taste of food, but also the aroma or the odor, as well as if it triggers our trigeminal senses in our mouth and nasal cavity. And I think flavor science is super interesting, and I have a whole video on this. I'll put the link in the description. But why I bring this up is that how much we like a food, what scientists have seen now is taste is actually not as important as the aroma is. So about 80% of why we like a food is due to its aroma. We'll say like 20%. This really comes down to the basic taste. So whether we like the sweet, sour, salty, bitter, or umami, taste of the food. So what Blumenthal is saying is that it's really these specific molecules that start in the food, migrate into the air, and then move into our nose, this aroma of the food. This is what determines if foods are a good pair. And the more of the aroma compounds that overlap between the two foods, the better the pair, right? That's the foundation of the food pairing hypothesis. But this matching of aromas, this is not the only reason we pair different foods or ingredients together. There's actually a whole nother category I want to talk about that deals with more like the perception or how food or drinks feel in our mouth as we're eating a meal. So this next set of factors, these are called the perceptual pairing principles. A great example of this is called the rinsing effect. Essentially, you pair a specific beverage with a food because that lets you take advantage of every single bite of that food. What I mean is like you pick a beverage that sort of washes the food away or cleanses the palate, so that each bite of your food is sort of like the first bite, right? You enjoy it just as much. And maybe a good example of this is if you ever had like a fizzy carbonated beer with something greasy like a hamburger. So when you drink that beer, it's like the bubbles sort of clean off your tongue, clean off your mouth, wash that grease down. So the next time you take a bite of the food, you have the same mouthfeel. You enjoy sort of that fattiness, that greasiness of the hamburger because of this rinsing effect. One study also saw that tea is really great at the rinsing effect because it has these tiny molecules called emulsifiers that are really good at trapping that grease, that fat, and then washing it down our throat instead of it staying in our mouth. Another one of these principles is decrease of a sensory property. And all this means is that a companion food might actually mask or correct something we don't really like about the other food. This is why we so often pair wine and cheese together. Because some wines, if you drink them without any food, they actually become too astringent. You start to dislike it. And astringency, if you're not sure what this is, it's sort of like that dryness in your mouth when you drink a wine, or it makes your mouth sort of pucker up. That's astringency. But the beauty of pairing wine with cheese is that the cheese sort of corrects or masks that astringency. Because if you have cheese in between sipping your wine, the cheese actually sort of washes down the astringency so that when you take the next sip of wine, it's sort of like starting anew, starting with a clean palate. Where otherwise, if there's no cheese, the astringency keeps increasing and increasing and increasing as you're drinking the wine until it's actually too astringent, you're going to stop drinking it. In a bit of the opposite direction, we can also use food pairings to enhance a sensory property. This just means one of the products sort of improves or makes a characteristic of the other food even better. It's sort of like a synergistic relationship. There's a ton of interesting food pairings like this. For example, if you eat like a greasy, fatty food before drinking wine, this actually brings out the more buttery notes of the wine. It's also been seen that if you have chocolate before drinking tea, the tea you perceive it as more well-rounded. It's more milky. It sort of has these aromas of dried fruits and even tastes like a bit more caramely. This carryover effect, it's thought to be due to residues of the first food remaining in your mouth when you start eating that second food, and this would change how you perceive that second food. Another possibility is that the aromas of the two foods begin to mix once you start that second food, and we perceive the mixed aroma differently than just the two separate aromas. It's sort of like saying 1 + 1 could equal 3. There's maybe synergy between the two aromas that just aren't there separately. Another factor that we've seen globally in food pairing, we've observed this over and over again, is that we like to pair foods that are very similar in intensity. So we don't like one food or drink to totally overpower the other. We would much prefer to have a balance in intensity. And this balance has been seen, whether you're pairing beer and soup, wine and cheese, wine and a bunch of different Italian dishes tested. It's just been seen that we much prefer a balance in intensity than not. There is still a whole category of factors I haven't covered, and these are called the conceptual pairing principles. Basically, these are just external factors that impact whether a match is acceptable or not. So it has nothing to do with like the specific foods or the food and drink. It's these other things happening around us that actually determine whether something is a good match or not. The first of these principles, this is quality level. And this just means you're going to pair foods or a food and a drink that are of the same quality level. And I mean, think about it. If you have like a fancy, expensive, highbrow wine, you're not going to pair that with a McDonald's hamburger. I don't care if the flavor map says they have a lot of overlapping aroma. Like, just based on quality level, you're going to pair that expensive wine with a dish that is of the same quality, right? It's just absurd otherwise. Next is specific situation. And all this factor is trying to say is that the acceptability of some food pairings really just depends on your location, what time are you eating this meal, or even who are you with? I mean, do you eat or drink differently than if you go out with friends versus maybe if you eat a meal with your parents? Or what you will pair together might just depend on, like, are you at a French restaurant or a German brew house? We tend to make food pairings that match a specific context. The last factor I want to talk about is norms, because when it comes to what you eat and how you eat it, a lot of this depends on what was acceptable in your family and in your culture when you were growing up. For example, me as an American, I love to pair peanut butter and jelly. I love a peanut butter jelly sandwich ever since I was a kid. And when I moved to the Netherlands, I noticed you could not catch a Dutch person ever eating a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. That pairing is just not normal to them. It's not acceptable. It's not appetizing, even though I'd be sitting there eating my peanut butter and jelly. What I'm saying is with food and cuisine, there's actually a lot of learned behavior that seems normal to you because that's what you saw when you were a child. If you enjoyed this video, next I would check out my video on why we absolutely cannot resist chocolate.